and I want to welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited to have everybody here to talk about centaurs and snake kings, and I think this is a fantastic theme to start off your Halloween, to go into ancient Greek mythology and really delve into the meaning of some of these fantastic creatures that have fascinated us for so long. And just to start off, for those who don't know me, my name is Anya Leonard. I'm the founder and director of Classical Wisdom, which is a site dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. So if you are new to us, please go to our Substack, classicalwisdom.com, and check out our free newsletter. We also have lots of podcasts, magazines, ebooks, everything to satisfy your classics curiosities and interests. And today I want to welcome Jeremy McIntyre, the professor of classical studies at the University of Pennsylvania. He is the editor of A Companion to Ethnicity in the Ancient Mediterranean and author of many books, including The Fold of Parnassus, The Cattle of the Sun, Greece in the Ancient World, and most recently, Centaurs and Snake Kings, Hybrids and the Greek Imagination, with which we will be speaking today. Thank you, Jeremy, so much for joining me.
Thank you, Anya. It's great to be here.
Now, just to give everybody a bit of an order of events, we are going to be discussing, Jeremy and I, some ideas and themes from his book to begin with. But we will be taking questions throughout in the chat box. And then at the end, in about 40 minutes, 45 minutes, we will be addressing audience questions. So if everybody can find their chat box and just, I will write here, hello. Tell me where you're joining us from. As I always love to point out, we are a very international endeavor. So Jeremy is joining us in Philadelphia. Sean, our managing editor, is in Northern Ireland, and he'll be helping out throughout curating questions for us. And just one other thing before we get going, I want to let everybody know that our next event is November 22nd. We will be discussing why Socrates matters, and it will be featuring Donald Robertson, who will be releasing his new book, How to Think Like Socrates, Armand de Angor of Oxford, Angie Hobbs of Sheffield, and Massimo Pigolucci, who also is big in the Stoic and the Socrates discussion. So it will be a great discussion as well. And very different, obviously, from mythology to philosophy, but that is the wonders of the classical world. We have so much to delve into. So with that, let us move on to the Greek imagination. So Jeremy, we go back to mythology, and there's just so many cool creatures. They're wondrous, monstrous hybrids. How did these composite creatures arise from the very beginning, and this entanglement of humans and animals?
That's a great question and a really good place to start. And it's actually a much more surprising answer than I originally thought when I first started on this project. One of the things I've come across in the course of working on this is really interesting evidence for burials going back into the Neolithic, where body parts of humans were replaced with either body parts from animals or even by inanimate objects. These are bodies where, for example, a human jaw might be missing and a pig's mandible has been put in its place, or where the entire head is missing and a vase has been put into its place. And the current thinking about this is that the way we see human bodies as integral and put together as a singularity, there's you, there's me, there's these various other people here today, that in really early societies, it may have been that this idea of the integral body was actually balanced by a realization that bodies are pieces that are stuck together, sort of like Frankenstein. That we are our arms, our legs, our torso, our head. And in particular, if you disarticulate a body, say an animal that you've hunted, you realize, well, it's actually got, ribs and it's got legs and it's got a head, and these are different pieces. Well, if you can disarticulate a body, you can re-articulate it, you can put it together in other ways. So the composites that we've come up with, in a sense, grow out of the fact that there may be other ways of seeing the relationship between humans and animals, where there could even be substitution of body parts going on between them.
Wow, I had no
Yeah.
idea that that was something that was done. And you know, this is something I wanted to ask also is because it does seem to be kind of a universal
Yeah.
thing. Like, and I've lived in Mexico for a while, and you have the alebrijas and things like that.
Uh-huh.
You see it everywhere. So
Yeah.
is it just the Greeks, or I mean, everywhere you get hybrids?
No, there are hybrids in just about every culture. In fact, if you go online and you take any culture that you like and then ask hybrids and Mischwesen, as they're often called, mixed creatures, they exist everywhere, from basically indigenous culture in Australia right through the Orkney Islands. You can go, to any extremity and you'll find it. So they are everywhere, and I think what they have in common is that they are ways of challenging the order of the worlds that we live in. That whatever may be our understanding of the world that we see around us, deep inside us, we have an awareness that there could be other ways of existing in the world, of other ways of ordering the world. So the hybrid, because it is an anomaly, it puts together bits that don't really fit together. It highlights our anxiety about the way things fit together in the world. Can I give you a kind of dumb example of this, which everyone, whenever I tell people this, they just find it wonderful. If you've ever seen Gary Larson's cartoons of the Far Side,
Yes,
right?
big fan.
There's a famous one called The Artist's Dilemma. And in it, an artist is sitting in front of an easel and he's been painting a cow. And so on the easel, you can see a cow's body, four legs, udders, a tail. But the artist's dilemma is he doesn't know what head to put on it. And so in the thought bubble above his head, you see a duck and a crocodile and a hippopotamus head. And of course, the joke is we all know what fits on a cow's body is a cow's head. But there is this way in which we play with contrafactuals, things that don't really exist, and which fit together maladroitly or incorrectly, as a way of reminding ourselves that there are other ways of being in the world. There are other ways of configuring the human. There are other ways. And what would it be like? And this is the thought experiment that the hybrid offers. What would it be like if these other creatures were around us all the time? Um, they serve different functions in different communities, different societies, but I think that's what they have in common. They challenge order and they make us contemplate anomaly. Typically, the Greeks took it in a very interesting direction in terms of philosophy, so that Empedocles really tried to articulate the idea that at the moment of creation there were all sorts of 10,000 forms of what humans could be, and that for him something like the Minotaur was in fact an example of one of these aberrations from the original moment when you had ox-headed humans. And they didn't survive. They weren't appropriate. They weren't right, and so they all died out. But there remains this sense that we've got in our storytelling that there might have been a time when that's how we were. There might be another time when we could become like that. What would that be like? What would it be like to live in a world of anomaly as opposed to the order that we take for granted?
I fear I'm much less imaginative than these Greeks. I mean, I don't walk around and just think, I wonder if that person's head was actually a duck or something. And I wonder if there's like a historicity to it that maybe, you have disabled babies that people would think of, or, is it something that we can still see children do and that we
Oh, it's not
modern
just children.
adults are just boring? I don't.
Oh, no, 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 not at all. Anya, I was walking through the Dallas airport a couple of years ago, right? And it's important that it's in Dallas. It was in
Okay.
Texas. And there was a men's clothing store that I walked past where all the mannequins were wearing cowboy shirts and cowboy jeans and cowboy boots, but they had a bull's head in place of a human head in every one of these. Now you look at it and there's one part of you that just walks past. There's another part of you that thinks, oh, well, it's Texas, of course it's going to be bullheaded. And the way in which that is both sort of comprehensible, even though it's odd, and even though we know it doesn't exist, that's that quality that some hybrids have. They're not monsters. You don't look at it and say, "Oh my God, that's horrific. I can't stand that." There's this current trend in scholarship to spend a lot of time worrying about monsters, but I think hybrids are much more interesting because hybrids are in fact something that you kind of recognize, and you recognize that it's not exactly appropriate, but it's not really scary. It just gives you that huh moment, which I think is actually more interesting than horror.
Yeah, my response was going to be, huh, and it's interesting that you kind of point that out because once you really start thinking about it, you can see more hybrids in our world than maybe
Mm.
we first realized. And like last night, I was trying to pick out some old classic musicals to show my daughter, and
Yeah,
Cats was one of them. And you've got
there
all
you
these
go.
people with sort of cat heads, and you're like, yeah, that's a perfect
Yeah,
example. I mean, I know they're supposed to be dressing up as cats, but we don't need them to look like real cats. We just need them to
yeah,
look like humans with cat heads,
yeah, yeah.
and we're
It's
fine with that.
definitely true that the world of children's lit and children's stories, whether it's Harry Potter or whether it's Percy Jackson, they have a lot more of these. So, our children's imaginations are very well equipped to handle all of this. But it's still there in the adult world as well. I can go past a mobile gas station down the street from where I live, and who's on it but Pegasus?
Yeah.
And again, Pegasus is not a monster. He's an anomaly. He's not the way a horse really looks, but it serves a slightly different function. And that sense of wonder is, I think, what our imaginations crave, and our imaginations generate these images as ways of dealing with complex worlds. We have both the world we live in, but also a kind of consideration of other ways that the world could be. This is why, at the moment, the huge trend in popular culture is towards zombies and the zombie apocalypse. Well, there is no one on this screen here today who has seen a zombie. No one here who was ever bitten by a zombie, but that's a big part of our cultural repertoire because it's a great way of expressing anxieties about the world we live in. That's what our imagination's there for.
Yeah, well, we've done a few events and such over like apocalypses and such, and I
Uh-huh.
always sort of go on to the fact that people really wish the immanentization of the eschaton, that like we want to be at the end of days somehow.
Yeah.
Feel like it's more of an ego thing that we're really important because we're like the last people. Um, but to keep it on track,
Yeah.
if I may, to kind of go from our modern experience back to the Greeks, of which we
Yeah.
sort of dedicate this project to. How did these sort of enmeshments kind of reflect the Greeks' experience in the Mediterranean?
Oh, that's a really good question. So, Greece is an area that looks really small when you look at a map of the Mediterranean. But if you look at the actual coastline and measure it compared to the rest of the Mediterranean, it actually is about a quarter of the total Mediterranean coastline. And what that means is that wherever you are in Greece, you're actually close to the water, and the Greeks are constantly leaving Greece and going out. They're constantly sailing up to the Black Sea, they're sailing down to Africa. They're sailing west to Italy, to Sicily, Magna Grecia, all the way over to Spain. And as a result of that, they are constantly meeting other human beings who look like them, broadly speaking, but who sound completely different. So they're constantly dealing with this dynamic of similar and different. And hybrids are a perfect way, I think, of encapsulating the oddity of other cultures that are like us but are not the same as us. It is a way of expressing a kind of in-betweenness, particularly when you frankly get real hybridity going on in actual human populations. That is to say, when you've got Phoenicians living in Western Sicily and you've got Greeks living in Western Sicily, eventually what happens is communities either fight each other or they come together and you end up with things like bilingual children, half Phoenician, half Greek. This is a very productive and fertile area where you're getting people who actually are moving between cultures. And hybridity is, in fact, hybridity of symbols and of animals and of critters is actually a perfect way of expressing what is in them, namely a hybridity of their own cultural identity.
Wow, yeah, that's fascinating. And I can see how that would be pushing the bounds of normalcy. You know, you have
Yeah,
this culture that has been going
yeah,
for so long, this is how you do things. And then when you meet
yep.
somebody who does things just a bit differently, same but different, you know, you have
Same,
to
same, but different.
question all the
Yeah,
things that you have just been
yeah,
doing
yeah.
as is normal.
Yeah, I mean, can I give you a couple of examples of this? Because I think they're really interesting. Cyprus is the island where this is really prominent. And if you think about where Cyprus is located, it's got Greece to the west, it's got Assyria to the east, it's got today Turkey to the north. So you get all these populations mixing and moving here. And what happens is that in many cases, they actually get on reasonably well, strangely enough. It's not always that it's a source of conflict. So we've got, for example, a really fascinating inscription called the Idalion Bilingual, and on it, a fellow called Balrom is making a dedication to Reshep in Phoenician, and on the same inscription in Greek, Balrom is making a dedication to Apollo. And so it's this one man who actually acknowledges both the Phoenician god and the Greek god in Phoenician script and in Greek script. The two are actually enmeshed. And that
Wow.
seems to be the quality that's often turning up in the ancient Mediterranean, where Greeks are meeting other people and then um, having to think about, well, what does it mean? What does being Greek mean? What does being human mean when I've got these other people who speak differently? Yeah. And Cyprus is the place where you get all these hybrid figures. My favorite hybrid of all antiquity is a piece from Cyprus, which is a centaur, in other words, human and horse, and the human part has both male and female genitalia. It's a hermaphrodite centaur. Isn't
That
that wild?
that's a lot of combinations, yeah.
It's a
Um,
lot of combinations, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
so I'm wondering, you know, when we think of these hybrids, what kind of view did the Greeks see them? Like, and I think, of course, you have plenty of examples of gods that are sort of hybrids from ancient Egypt,
Yeah.
specifically, like off the top of my mind. There's plenty there. Did they think of them positively? Were they afraid of them? Is it like how did were some
That's
interactions with these
that's
hybrids better or
Yeah,
worse?
that's a really interesting question because in the past, we tended to say that, well, the Egyptians have their animal-headed gods, their theriomorphic gods, whereas the Greek gods are all anthropomorphic. And it was this very clear contrast. But in fact, the more we look at the Greeks, the more we see that's not the case at all. For example, there's a cult of Demeter Melina in the middle of the Peloponnese in a place called Phigalia, where the description of the cult statue is that this is Demeter as a very large woman wearing a woman's dress, woman's arms, woman's legs, and with the head of a horse. And the story behind it is that when Poseidon wanted to sleep with her, to rape her, frankly, he changed into a stallion and she changed into a mare, and then they mated. And so she's represented this way because the gods can move between human and animal form in a way that, that we can't. Um, there's also nearby another cult of a figure called Eurynome, and the description of her, she's one of the sea goddesses, and the description of her makes it clear she's what you and I would call a mermaid. She's a woman from the waist up and a fish from the waist down. So there are some versions of these hybrids that are absolutely high status and well considered. There are others, Skilla would be the best example probably, where again, it's half woman and half some sort of fishy creature, and she's a monster. She snatches sailors and kills them. And so, there's no simple answer of are they good or are they bad? They can be either one. And in fact, often what happens is that once a figure has been demonized, particularly the female figures, quite frankly, once they've been demonized, often they're also sexualized. those two go together in many of the Greek hybrids. So, for example, in the case of Scylla, as I said, she's a woman and a sea serpent. But around her waist, there are often little dogs' heads yapping, and this is partly a play on her name because Scylla is a word that's related to the Greek word for a dog. Even in modern Greek today, your little puppy is called skilaki. But a very really interesting study of this done in the last few years has suggested that that figure of the dog head yapping, is in fact a representation of the vagina dentata, the vagina with teeth. So that that monster, which a sailor might encounter in the Straits of Messina, is double determined as a monster because it's also the woman who might emasculate you. The same thing applies to, sorry, do you want
No,
me to
no,
go
no,
on with
no.
another?
Okay. No, no,
All
no.
right.
Please do. Yeah.
So Medusa is another example of this because Medusa is she's one of the three Gorgons. The other two are both immortal, but she's mortal, and as you know, she gets beheaded by Perseus. She's often represented as being quite hideous. The early representations, the really, really strange representation of her early on is from Eleusis, where the head that's been decapitated and on the other bodies still there is actually modeled on a cauldron. It's sort of a magical object because cauldrons transform through cooking and also they're used in religious practices. But later on, particularly in the 5th century, Medusa is shown as, frankly, a sexually attractive young woman. And the scenes in the attic vases of Medusa are really disturbing because Perseus is normally shown looming over her while she's asleep. So that this simple tale of the hero who defeated the monster actually becomes very much like a really creepy depiction of a man stalking a woman, preparing to attack her in a sleep. So they
Yeah.
serve many different functions.
Plenty of the Greek heroes, when you look at them in different lights, don't look particularly heroic.
They're not so good. Well, Perseus is a really fascinating one. We know less about him than many of the others because he's primarily associated with Argos rather than Athens. And so he doesn't get as good a rep in Athens. But in Argos, it looks as if we've got models of Gorgon heads made of terracotta. You can see them in the Nafplion Museum. And it's been really plausibly argued that these heads were frankly full face masks that were worn in rituals where boys becoming men, somewhere, around puberty, are ceremonially meant to slay the Gorgon. And this is the way that the boy demonstrates that he's leaving the world of women and entering the world of men. And how does he do that? By slaying this monstrous woman.
It's
So,
so,
you know,
yeah. Go on.
go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say it's so interesting to think that, like, if you study anthropology, you have all these sort of coming of age rituals that are right you can still find today, and it's always
Yeah.
that example of I always think of Bertrand Russell that if you really want to travel in time, you can actually just travel to different places and kind of get these insights. So
Yeah.
it is amazing to see just how important these myths were involved
Yeah.
in important rituals like coming of age, and that these myths were very intertwined with people's lives rather than just something you read at story time.
Yeah, absolutely. These are woven into people's lives. That's part of the training of children. Most religious cults in Greece have a backstory, an aition that tells you how it came about, and often these involve either monsters or hybrids. So they're really widespread. Yeah.
Was the animal that was involved in the hybrid um meaningful with regards to how that hybrid was dealt with? So if it was like a vicious
Yeah.
animal or a kind
Yeah.
animal, you know.
Yeah, that's also a great question. And the answer is yes. One of the categories that I'm really interested in is the hybrids of humans and snakes. And, we would normally, because snakes have generally a very bad reputation in our culture, they're not well looked upon generally. Excuse me, somebody's going to leap down my throat about that. I know that they don't have a positive a positive association. In ancient Greece, they were slightly differently regarded because snakes were often seen as being symbols of the fact that um, they were the ancestors and they connected us with the past and they also connected us with the earth because snakes are of the ground. And so many Greek communities told stories about being autochthonous. They were from that soil. And the snake, therefore, was a way of representing that. In Athens, for example, there were snakes that lived up on the Acropolis. When they disappeared, the Athenians knew, oh, the Persians are coming, we've got to get out of town because the snakes have abandoned us. But they also then, through their mythology and with these figures of hybrids, created a series of early kings like Erichthonius and Erechtheus and Cecrops, who were all snake kings. They were actually human from the waist up and snake from the waist down. And that's not turning them into monsters. That's actually turning them into figures of venerability. They're ancient. They suggest that we always were here and we grew out of this very earth. And if you look at the archaic Acropolis, probably the largest temple on the Acropolis before the Parthenon was the Hecatompedon. And we have the architrave of that. It's at the top of the stairs if you go up the steps of the Acropolis Museum in Athens. And one of the figures in that triangular pediment is a figure that's often referred to as Blackbeard. And it's a figure that has three human torsos all next to each other, but they lead into this long entwined snake. And there's been a lot of debate about who these figures are, but I think they're ancestor figures representing the early Athenians. So before Theseus becomes the really big hero at the end of the 6th century, before that, the Athenians are basically advertising they are descended from these snake kings.
Wow. Again, I
Yeah,
had no idea that the snake was seen as so positively. And I guess my
yeah,
first thought is it's actually seen kind of positively in Celtic mythology too, right? With the Ouroboros and
yeah, yeah.
um,
And the really interesting thing is that in I don't know so much in the Celtic instance, but certainly in the Greek instance, you can have snakes in hybrid figures and in the world of myth. But you can also have a really clear understanding that snakes are deadly creatures. There's a long poem written about them called the Theriaca, and there are something like 200 versions of snakes identified in the poem, and many of these are really deadly. One of them is so deadly that if you even hold a bag that the snake has been put in, the venom passes from its skin into the bag and will give you blisters and send you crazy. So they can both see snakes as being dangerous animals, but also as symbolically something that represents our connection with the earth. That kind of paradox is very, very typically Greek.
well, and I guess it's very interesting, and I've had a few different conversations with professors over the years regarding the relationship ancient Greeks or the ancients had with animals, specifically
Yep.
with Mark Usher, for instance. He's written a few books about that, and it's interesting because I suppose, like, besides the sort of the dog revolution of these days, where everybody, what's it? Dogs are the new kids, kids are the new
Yeah.
plants, and plants are out, or something like that. It's besides sort of the pets that people have,
Yeah.
we just don't interact with animals in the same level that you would have in the ancient world. And when it comes to
Right.
monsters and hybrids, I mean, that's very important to keep in mind. Like,
Yep.
lions still roamed.
Yep.
It's got to be more like, again, going back to like travel. If you're
Yep.
in places in India, you still have to be worrying about being eaten by a snake or a tiger. Like, for most of us, this is not something we wake up and worry about.
No, you're quite right. And it means then that, we have in fact lost a connection with the natural world that was much more immediate and close in antiquity. One aspect of that I find interesting is that we lose sight of the fact that in the ancient world, bulls and cattle in general weren't just domesticated herds. There were still wild bulls in existence. They existed, in Europe up until about the very early 17th century. So It's not surprising that you find bulls turning up as part of royal iconography with, ancient Near Eastern kings always having bull helmets. It's that the animal itself was a threat. It could still be quite wild. They weren't all domesticated. So, the Greeks had their snake kings. The Near Eastern peoples tend to have their bull-headed kings. Gilgamesh is, the wild bull as well. So that movement between wild and civilized or wild and domesticated is one thing that is still very contingent in the ancient world. It's not finalized. That whole Aristotelian view of the world as a sort of scala naturae with us at the top and all the various animals going down below neatly laid out, that's always in danger of breaking down when you've got lions and when you've got wild bulls and when you've got these creatures that represent real threats. And, it's not a surprise then that one of the very earliest hybrid figures we've ever got from the Aurignacian period in Germany is the Löwenmensch. It's a mammoth bone that's been carved. It's about yay big. It's been carved into a human with a lion's head on it. So, a lot of people who work in that area, this is earlier than my work, would argue that some of the first symbols that humans ever came up with, our imagination at work, is actually considering what about if a lion and a man were merged?
Yeah, and you then embolden yourself by encapsulating the thing that you fear, that's kind of the conquering of it. Um,
Sure.
and it's interesting. I mean, obviously the bulls are very important featuring in the Minoan culture and in
Yeah.
Crete. And
Yeah.
it's interesting to see sometimes these rituals that have been preserved in
Yeah.
unlikely ways. And I think with the bull, you see it go into the gladiator era and then preserved on the Iberian Peninsula. And
Yeah.
then, if you go to small towns in Colombia or Mexico, you still see full
Yeah.
stadiums turning out to see bullfighting. So
Yeah.
it's interesting to see these vestiges of the culture maintained to this very
You
day.
know, in the Greek world, there's a very interesting inflection of that takes it in a slightly different direction because you're quite right. The Minoans obviously have bull games. We know about bull jumping. It's depicted in figurines. It's depicted on glyptic. It's shown on wall paintings. Clearly, the Minoans have a bull cult, right? There's no doubt about that. But when the Minoan Cretans are conquered by the Mycenaean Greeks coming down, around 1400, 1350, I think what happens is that bull cult is totally demonized. That the conquerors coming from the mainland are basically having none of this, and they're turning it into the symbol of the culture that they've conquered, that they're now treating as inferior, and that is the moment when the Minotaur symbol starts to take off. That you take what was a valid expression of religious awe, the power of the gods expressed through this bull, and you tell stories about Pasiphae who unnaturally desired to have sex with a bull and who gives birth to this hideous child, which is a bull child, bull man, who then is put down into the labyrinth and left down there to, devour the victims that are sent to it. This is all the demonization of a pre-existing cult, which was in fact, nothing like that at all. So that's another way in which hybrids can do really interesting work. That you can now use that as a way of demonizing your enemies.
Wow, yeah, there's okay. So just to say very quickly, I can see we're getting some really good questions coming in, and I do want to move on to questions maybe about 5 minutes or so because I
Sure.
want to make sure we have enough time for the audience to ask because they're really good questions I'm seeing. But I do want to delve into maybe just one or two more
Sure.
examples of interesting
Sure.
hybrids
Sure.
before we go on. And we had previously been speaking about the Sphinx, so I think
Yeah.
it might be interesting to see kind of how the Sphinx kind of came about and the different ways that we see the Sphinx or the different ways the ancients saw the Sphinx.
Right. So the Sphinx is a really good place to go to because The changes in Sphinx iconography and in the meaning of the Sphinx demonstrate the way that hybrids are unstable. They're not one thing that carries on in each culture. So if you think about the rows of sphinxes that line the temples of the Egyptian gods, particularly the goat-headed sphinxes, these are not monsters. They are expressions of divine power, and they're part of a universe in which the gods are figured as being part animal and part human. And that actually gets then uh, inverted or modified in figurines that are highly portable and transportable, particularly ivories about yay big, that show, say, lion-headed bodies, but with a female head, lion bodies, excuse me, with a female head on top, which become very popular in the ancient Near East. By the time these get to Greece, they're even repurposed again. And eventually in Thebes, of course, the Sphinx becomes the figure that is this monster who is afflicting the countryside and who has to be defeated by Oedipus. That change all along shows you that you can have forms of hybrids being passed along, but the meaning that goes with them is dramatically changed. They don't remain the same at all.
So why do you think that that change occurs?
I think they get redeployed to serve new ends because if you receive an object that's come in as a, say, a luxury item, it's traveled hundreds and hundreds of kilometers and a trader has brought it in and wants to swap it for wine or grain or what have you. You may say, well, that's made of ivory and it's very beautiful and it's got great technical skill behind it, but it doesn't mean you know what it means in its original context. And so it can be redeployed. The best example of that is a figure that's often referred to as the Minoan genius. You might have seen these on some signet rings where the creature actually looks like a gigantic insect that is parading before one of the gods or goddesses. And it's been pretty clearly shown that this was adopted from Taweret, an Egyptian goddess in the middle of the second millennium. But in Egypt, that goddess becomes she's a combination of a lion and a hippopotamus, and she becomes the goddess who actually nurtures Pharaoh. So she's a sort of a mother figure and a figure in between the gods and the pharaoh. Well, if you don't have a pharaoh in Minoan Crete, that figure serves some other purpose. Now, it may be wild to look at, and you may think that's really peculiar, but it doesn't mean that you carry the meaning over from its origin. The scholar who worked on this just succinctly put it when she said, Taweret turns up in Minoan contexts, but whether she meant in Minoan context what she meant in Egyptian context is not at all clear.
So
So
every
we
culture, go ahead.
no, I'm just saying we repurpose these for our own uses. Yeah.
So every culture kind of has their own hybrids and their own imagination and
Yeah.
creations. And then they sort of swap them around and then they sort of evolve that way. Is that sort of like
Yeah.
how they're
Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, to give you an example, there is a figure in Philippine mythology, which is a hybrid. It's called the Tikbalang. And the Tikbalang is basically like a centaur. It's half human and half horse. But it probably, I'm not an expert on this, but it's usually argued that it forced itself onto the consciousness of the people living in the Philippines with the arrival of the Spaniards who brought horses. It's like a new arrival. And yet it also gets repurposed, it is said, later on as a symbol to represent aborted fetuses. In other words, it's wild and strange and weird. Now, that's got nothing to do with the Greek centaur, but it actually probably has a very similar point of origin, namely the arrival of the horse in Greek culture, and particularly the arrival of horse riding as opposed to using horses for chariots. The Greeks only started riding on the backs of horses quite late, probably around 9 or 800 BC. Before that, horses are always shown as pulling chariots. So when you actually make the decision to get on the horse, if you think about it for a moment, that is psychologically a very profound moment because the human is trying to tame this wild critter. It's a creature that, could kill a human by throwing it off and stamping on it if it wanted to. So there's a battle of wills going on. And symbolically, or if you want, even in terms of vision, the fusion of the two is really a powerful image.
Yeah. I
And
had
so I
always
think
sort of
those
thought that,
images,
yeah,
yeah,
sorry, there's one small delay, so I
sorry,
just
go.
I didn't mean to interrupt. But I was going to say that I had I'm just trying to recall that was it the Scythians that were sort of the first horseback riders was that then a foreign kind of expression again for the Greeks to see these sort of foreign horseback riders?
Yeah, it certainly seems to begin up on the steppes in those steppe cultures. And when horses first begin to appear in the Greek world in the second millennium, they're nearly always associated with chariot warfare. All right, so we know the Egyptians are pulling their war chariots with horses, and we know the Assyrians are doing that as well. But then at some point after the turn of the millennium, 1000 BC, someone gets the idea that you could actually get on the back of the horse and you could ride that horse into battle or use it for scouting or what have you. And that again is another one of these psychologically charged moments. And those are the moments that often generate these imaginative responses in new symbols, new pictures, new images.
Do you think there was ever these kind of ideas and creative creatures born out of not being in your normal state of mind? I mean, like I think of like sailors imagining these mermaids and such. I mean,
Yeah.
were they drunk? You know, and they own something? Is that a possibility?
There's definitely a possibility of that. I think at Eleusis, I think increasingly we're prepared to accept the idea that people were taking in through this sacred drink, the kykeon, a substance that might have been mildly psychotropic. And if you add to that the fact that people are quite exhausted after walking out to Eleusis and probably fasting as well, I think that there are moments when people are psychologically primed for these episodes. It's sometimes been argued that these minor hybrid scary figures called the Myrmolykeion might have actually been masks worn by people at Eleusis in the middle of the night when the initiates are first witnessing the advent, the epiphany of the goddesses. And so you would have this sort of moment of terror, and then you see the goddesses. And if you think about it, when these statues are brought in the middle of the night, they're not using neon lights or flashlights. They've got torches with the light flickering around them. These would have looked like gigantic living creatures. So, you have that as the epiphany, but it's set up probably by an engagement with something that's really scary, the
Yeah,
bogeyman.
yeah, boogeyman. And of course, today is a good day to bring up the scary and to make a form out of your fears, I
Oh yeah,
suppose.
yeah. We can talk more about that if you want, or if you want to go to the questions. But the boogeyman figures are really fascinating in Greek storytelling.
Well,
That
maybe we should talk a little bit about
okay,
the boogeyman, actually. I mean, I've got these questions, and I think we have maybe we can a few more questions coming in. But
okay,
I would like to actually talk about the boogeyman, if we may, because
okay.
I think that's fascinating.
Well, they're very understudied, and I think the reason for that is that A, they're nearly all female figures, and B, they're largely associated with the nursery. These are the stories that you tell children. Those are just not areas that get a lot of academic investigation. But I think they're interesting because it tells you something of the mentality of the Greeks. These figures are called mormons. They're also called lamias. And the stories that are told about these nearly always identify them as young women who either lost a child at childbirth or themselves died at childbirth. So these are the fears that surround that really difficult moment. And if you think about Greek girls getting married and having their first pregnancy and confinement when they're about 15, you understand why we have higher rates of mortality around that age for women than we do for men. It's very, very fraught. And these popular figures in storytelling then represent those fears. Uh, and then as often happens with Greek stories, they then add another layer, which is often of these demonic figures as flesh devouring and sex crazed. These are figures like the Empusa and the Lamia that are seen as preying on young men, and they'll drink their blood, eat their flesh, have sex with them in order to eventually devour them. And in fact, many of the tropes that we're familiar with from vampire stories actually can be traced right back to these Greek stories. And through no coincidence, Greek folk tales even today still have stories of the vrikolakas, the bloodsucker. So
Um,
yeah.
no, go on, sorry.
No, no, that's it. That's it.
Well, no, I was just going to say because that actually delves perfectly into a question from the audience from Fiona.
Yep.
So I thought I would just continue that segue, which is interested in thoughts around modern hybrids reported, such as dogmen and werewolves, and how these may have been born out of classical hybrids.
Yeah. Yeah, there was an English cleric who, in about 1900, was living in Florence, and he wrote a book about the hybrid monstrous figures in Italian folklore that he encountered while he was in Florence. And his descriptions of them, he actually explicitly says, are linked back to ancient accounts of bodily transformation, of werewolves. There are Greek stories about werewolves, particularly in the Peloponnese. And he noticed, think something very interesting, and that is that nearly all of these stories were told in Florence about the week between Christmas and New Year. In other words, the moment when you're about to finish one year and start another. These sort of psychologically potent periods. And that transformation is then being expressed as a transformation of creatures that you have to be aware of and wary of, scared of. So yeah, there's a line going from the ancient figures through to the modern. I mean, look, there was a burial found on Lesbos a few years ago that was from either the 16th or 7th century, where the body had been pierced by large iron spikes. And that's pretty much, our modern vampire story playing out in the late Middle Ages, but actually being traceable right back to antiquity. So yeah, there are definitely stories. These become stories that are popular in the Greek novels and in folk tales that are recorded, particularly in the Roman period. A lot of these are written down by writers called paradoxographers. They're interested in these scary stories about what you encounter in different parts of the Greek world under the Romans.
It's almost like an embodiment of the liminal that
Oh,
like
absolutely.
this just knowing that there's these and it is always I think it is we over rationalize in our world now, but I mean even still you get that sense at twilight, you get that sense in these moments of in between that it's just something's odd, like that feeling right before a storm even,
Yeah,
that
yeah,
we don't really act on it as much nowadays, but
yeah.
it's interesting to see that historically people have made stories out of these feelings.
Yeah, anything that unsettles the orderliness, even if it's just, a massive change in temperature or excessive wind, these are things that trigger responses from us. And I think hybrids are often a good way of giving some expression to that. And this plays out in really interesting ways. Let me give you another example. When the first platypus was taken from a sample was taken from Australia to England, the botanists, excuse me, the anatomists who looked at it said it's a fake because you couldn't have something that had the bill of a duck on the body of a mammal that gave birth to eggs, not to live young. That confuted all of the categories of amphibian and reptile and avian and mammalian. But in fact, that's what we have. These are monotremes, egg-laying marsupials. And so, we become used to our categories, and things that defy the categories are their existence can even be denied. And so, at the same time, the existence of these in our imagination means that while our rational mind is saying that doesn't exist, something over here is saying, yeah, but what about if it does?
Mm. No, I think the platypus still confuses everybody. At once I'm like, fair enough. I would probably, yeah. Um, Now, one of the questions, and this kind of ties in with the werewolf
Yeah.
as well, in a way, are there incidents of hybrids losing their hybrid quality and becoming either fully animal or fully human?
Well, The Golden Ass by Apuleius is probably the best example of a long-term transformation, which then miraculously is undone at the very end of the long story of his travails. And it's thanks to the intercession of the goddess. So, that's one version, but it's probably more common for people to be completely transformed into the animal. One really classic example, of course, is that wine vessel that was in Toledo. It's been returned to Italy. That shows the sailors who've kidnapped Dionysus all leaping into the water when the god has presented himself in his divine form, and they're all transforming into dolphins.
Mhm.
And they will stay as dolphins. Okay, so that's a complete transformation. How do you show a complete transformation in a vase which is static and can only show you a snapshot? Well, the artist has done a great job because he has some figures that are totally dolphin, some figures that are totally human, and then some that are half dolphin and half human. So you look at this and you think, oh, they're transforming right before my eyes. The other, of course, great example is Odysseus's men who are turned into animals by Circe, um, and there is in Boston an extraordinarily beautiful Kylix that shows Circe giving the magic potion to them. They think they're just drinking wine, and then they're all transforming. And you have a bunch of these. You can see them actually with a horse's head and with a snout and with the arms. And what's really fascinating, and this is an aspect we haven't talked about, what's really fascinating is that the Kylix that shows all these figures, between each of them has Greek letters. But if you say them out aloud, it's actually nonsense. They're not real words. So what you're doing there is you're having all these creatures being transformed, going blah, 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 blah. And the question is the intellect in there still human? Have they just lost the ability to speak as I'm speaking now? Or are they actually losing their human wits and becoming animal as well? And that's another way in which hybrids are really important because they give us a way to think about what is actually the nature of the human. There's a story told by Plutarch called the Gryllus, where a porker, a pig, is endowed with human language. And it has a long conversation where the human is saying, well, I think humans are superior because we're more courageous. And the porker will say, well, actually, no, pigs really will protect their young, and we kind of outdo humans when it comes to bravery. And the whole of the conversation makes you wonder, wow, when I see a pig snorting around there, does it have an intellect like mine? It just can't speak as I do?
Yeah,
In
this
what
is
sense does language make us human, you know?
Yeah, that is the question of identity is fantastic. And going back just quickly to Circe and her changing men, you
Yep.
almost wonder if it's like the story explaining what men become when they get absolutely smashed drunk. Like
Yep.
they
Yep.
drink these things, and then they start to not make sense and they act boorish. And there's that saying that different you become different animals at different glasses of wine, and that
Right,
like the
right,
fourth
right.
one you become like a boar or a
Yeah,
pig or something like that. And that you're like, is that person still the same person under the effects of alcohol? Do they
yeah.
maintain their self even though that the next day they don't remember it and they can't talk and they can't walk and they get on all fours and they act like animals? I mean, it's almost like a metaphor.
Absolutely. It's very much that. And the flip side of that, and this is much worse, frankly, because that I think is quite interesting and smart. But the flip side is when you get a poet like Simonides who writes the poem that's simply translated as On Women, and it gives you about 20 different types of women, of woman, and each one of them is in fact a type of animal. So we have the pig woman, the fox woman, the dog woman, the mare woman, and each one of these is vile. They are truly horrible. I was reading this with my class the other day. The pig woman is described as scrounging around in the filth of her house and actually sitting in a pile of shit in the corner, right? The mare woman, because mares are always seen by the Greeks as a symbol of beauty and sort of luxury, spends her time combing her hair and making goo-goo eyes at any other man in the house other than her husband. And it's a vile poem because what it suggests is that it was perfectly acceptable for a Greek audience of men, no doubt, to speak about all the different types of women as if they were all variations of horrible. And each of those horrors is conveyed by an animal. There is one form of good woman, and it's the bee woman because bees are seen as industrious. It's the only good woman in that entire catalogue. So the animal-human entanglement, that proximity that we've been talking about, we live in such close proximity to animals, particularly in the ancient world compared to today, that it becomes a very small leap to go from this is a human to what about if we're actually a bit more conjoined, enmeshed? And that allows us to think about, and not neutrally, it allows us to think about, but also in extremely misogynistic ways, what women are like. Or, as you say, in the case of Circe, what drunken men are like. Notice also that the agent there causing all the problems is the woman.
Yeah. Well,
And she's also foreign. She's a foreign witch. So if you ask about, what about these sailors going out? Well, what these sailors are doing is they're going out to a place where there are indigenous people.
yeah.
All the indigenous people in Greek stories end up being either killed or sexually exploited by the men or just ignored completely. That's the best that can happen, just about. This is not a happy cultural process that we're seeing, particularly in the archaic period.
Now, I want to get to some of our questions. I'm going
Yeah.
to start with Fiz's one and then go back to Abigail because I think this one just flows from the last point that you just said. So Fizz says, Jeremy, this is a profound idea of human conversing with an animal, or does human become an animal, still have the intellect in a different form? But I
Yeah.
want to ask, may I ask where I can find this conversation between the human and the pig?
Yeah, it's in Plutarch's Moralia, and it's a dialogue in Plutarch that's called the Gryllus, Gryllos, the Gryllus. And it's been written on by a few people. If you go to JSTOR and you're looking up academic articles, David Constant has written on this very, very well. And I think Stephen Newmeyer has also, yes, Stephen Newmeyer has also talked about this in his work. So there's quite a scholarly literature out there about that. Sorry to offer footnotes, but you asked me for bibliography, so.
No, that's perfect. Yeah, I think George Orwell would have something to say about this kind of
Oh yeah,
continuation as well.
yeah,
So to go to Abigail's question, you mentioned material additions and substitutions to body parts
yeah,
of hybriding the body. Coming from an
yeah.
art history perspective, I can't help but think of the Etruscan canopic urns, vessels with
Uh-huh.
human forms that would become
Yeah,
the physical double or prothesis of the person after death. In your
yeah.
research, can this type of material doubling count as a hybrid, or does just a vessel, does it rely on its function?
I think there is a kind of doubling going on, although I think the Etruscan cases, and this is not my area, but I would assume that the connection has been drawn between this and the canopic vessels from Egyptian culture. And also the other doubling that's interesting there is the Ushabtis, which are often seen as being substitutes for human slaves to serve in the underworld. Um, but there is a slight difference, of course, because the vessel contains human organs. And I'm not sure, I don't know whether we should be seeing the top of this as being somehow an evocation of the human that died, or whether it's associated with one of the underworld spirits, one of the De Inferni, as they would be called, the underground gods. I'm not sure about that, to tell the truth. I better shut up in case I say something stupid.
No. It's interesting because I mean, getting into just the whole spiritual world is is a whole other can of worms, as you say. So
Yeah.
maybe to stay close to the task at hand. Another question from Fiona: do you think that some of these ancient stories may have stemmed from actual experimentation? Sorry, bit grim, but I assume that the early forays into medical knowledge may have included this, and I'm immediately thinking of the island of Dr. Moreau.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Well, I don't think anything quite as vile as that is going on, partly because of things like anesthetics and post-operative infections, just to be really literal. But it is pretty clear that there were doctors in antiquity that were performing anatomical investigations. Aristotle actually refers to this. So we know that they were looking inside the body to see. But, and this is probably my own bête noire, I actually think it is the phenomenon of sacrifice, which is even more central to this, because in sacrifice, after you've cut the animal's throat and bled it out, you then not only skin it, but you literally disarticulate it. And we now know that the butchers in places like Athens, for example, were really efficient at doing this very, very quickly. We know from the hash marks on bones that they were using large cleavers to quickly separate legs and upper legs and lower legs and so forth. And the cut marks on the bones are also showing that they were then able to remove, for example, the fat from a thigh bone and remove the muscle from a thigh bone, the flesh, very, very quickly, which is important to do at moments of big sacrifice. And a lot of the anatomical knowledge that the Greeks have got, I think, are an outflow from that. It's similar to the way that, for example, there was a sort of a taboo in Japanese medicine against actually cutting open bodies. And some of the first people that actually were able to explore this were, in fact, butchers in Japanese culture because they were cutting open animal bodies. But the interior of the human body was not well known, which is why that the first anatomical drawings that came to Japan from the Netherlands were known then as rangaku, orange knowledge, because they were coming from the people of the Netherlands of Orange. Um, I think it's really interesting to ask where people acquire this knowledge. I doubt that it's from Dr. Moreau type experiments. God, I hope not.
yeah. Well, this is a good Halloween themed question of the dark and scary. We're going to ask another question from Fizz. When a god metamorphosizes into human form, do they take on all humanness, the socially disgusting aspects like burping or excretion,
Oh,
or are they divine in human image?
that is such a great question. I have a student who's working on exactly this at the moment, because if you look at the if you look at the Olympian gods, right, the ones we know from Homer and Hesiod that live up on Olympus, Zeus, Ares, and so forth, Hera, Aphrodite, and the rest of them, they exist as a sort of a perfect superpower version of us. They're like Marvel superheroes. They're like us but with superpowers, right? The one who is really excruciatingly human in his form is Hephaestus. He's the god who sweats. He's the god who has crippled legs, which many people connect with a sort of historical tradition in a number of cultures of uh, crippled people ending up being put to work in a metalworking foundry. Right? You can't work out in the fields, you can't run the plow, but you can actually hammer. So the blacksmith god is crippled, and he's actually called in Greek Amphigoes, and he's depicted on vases with twisted legs like that. So he's the great exception. And what's really fascinating is that Fritz Graf some years ago pointed out he's the god who works. If you're up on Olympus and you're sitting around in your perfection and you want to drink a cup of ambrosia, there are little automated trolleys that come and deliver it to you. And these were made by Hephaestus. So he actually makes automata for the gods, right? When Thetis wants new armor for her son, Achilles, what does she do? She goes to Hephaestus and he makes. If you ask, what did Ares make? What did Zeus make? Nothing. Like Zeus doesn't even make his own thunderbolts. They're made for him. So the gods are perfect, but from if I can put it this way, from a working class point of view, they're kind of useless. they're fine for the elite. If the elite want to sit around and have slaves do all the work for them, which they do, then the Olympian gods are fantastic. Um, Particularly because the Olympian male gods get to have sex with anyone they want to. They take any female, even if they're married, doesn't matter. They'll just go and grab any 20-year-old that they want. Um, but they don't do any work, whereas Hephaestus does. So if we're thinking about the corporeality and the humanity of the gods, Hephaestus is my man. He's good. He probably had bad breath, but what the hey?
A comment from Chris, or Smiths being crippled through exposure to arsenic and bronze alloys.
Oh, I that would be a very difficult, precise explanation to track down. You'd have to have the skeletal evidence of Smith's bodies to investigate to see, what the composition was of their bones. I think the more usual approach, I could be wrong, but if you want to look into this, Sandy Blakely has a book about metallurgy in Greece and Africa, which is a terrific study. And I think what transpires is that in societies where there is a much higher percentage of children born with an infirmity, we forget that. But again, that's a much greater reality in the ancient world or in the pre-modern world generally. Those children that actually survive, if they haven't been rejected completely and exposed, grow up with an infirmity, but they're not necessarily able to stand in line in battle, hold a shield, hold a spear, or do any of those sort of high class citizen activities. But also in terms of just hard work, they're less likely to be working in the fields or doing any of that. So unless they come from a very well-to-do family, the likelihood is that as a trade, you'd be pushed towards something like working in a smithy.
Yeah, and it's interesting just to say that when thinking about like the reality in the ancient world, I mean, of course,
Yeah.
there would have just been so many more people with disabilities and
Oh
deformities
yeah.
because not only would like nowadays something as simple as like you always make sure to take your iron when you're pregnant so
Yeah.
you don't get spina bifida. You've got
Yeah.
all those ailments, but then also like if you get ill as a child, you wouldn't get recovered, or maybe you just broke your leg badly and you've got a limp. I mean, you can imagine a lot of stories being born to explain
Oh,
the
absolutely.
deformities and the difficulties and disabilities that people would have
Oh,
had more
at
commonly.
every stage of a life cycle. I mean, the major politician before Pericles in Athens was a man called Cimon, and his father Miltiades had been the victor at the Battle of Marathon. But Miltiades, in the aftermath of that battle, in the full flush of victory, led the Athenians on an expedition to one of the islands nearby to conquer it. And jumping over a wall in the course of the siege, he broke his leg. Well, he died a few weeks later, probably of gangrene. Now, of course, it was treated at the time as evidence of divine disfavor because he had been on the verge of sacking a temple. So you seek an explanation that fits the mindset, the values, and the presuppositions of your community, rather than our explanation would be that he had a broken leg and it didn't knit properly and he died as a result.
This
But
is
yeah.
a good comment from Stephanie. Seems like hybridity is a dialogue between fear versus curiosity, embodying the power of the other versus being overpowered.
I think that puts it beautifully, and I completely agree, Stephanie. I think that's exactly what it is. Notice that both of these operate in areas that are outside of or can be outside of the rational mind. And this is where I think hybridity falls into the into the realm of imagination, imaginative contemplation, thought experiment, the capacity to imagine other worlds, other ways of being. Absolutely. Can I illustrate this? One of my favorite pieces of art from the last decade is a large wall painting that went up in Athens during the economic crisis of 2013. And on the side of a building, there is a gigantic cutout made of wood that shows a boy holding a Molotov cocktail. And he's wearing shorts and sneakers, but where his head should be, there is a ragdoll head. He looks like something from Frankenstein. And it above him on one side it says, "Welcome to Athens." And you think, well, he's about to set fire to everything. It's a Molotov cocktail, right? He's holding a bottle and it's about to burst into flames. The whole thing is on the side of a burnt out building, a real burnt out building. And when you look at it, you don't run away in horror. It's not a monster, but it really fixes you. It just grabs you, and you think a whole range of complicated thoughts like that's really weird, that's really kind of beautiful, it's kind of scary. It's a statement about the conditions in Athens at the time, which were pretty dire. It's also something that shows you an imaginative response to those, and therefore is sort of awesome. So it's that range of possibilities. And I think Stephanie's getting at it there with fear and curiosity. Fear, curiosity, wonder, awe, sometimes horror, but sometimes also just, huh?
Mm.
You know,
Yeah.
this
I
is this
keep
is
every time you say it makes you go, huh? I'm always like, yeah.
well, the best person of all the theorists who work on this area, and there have been a lot. I still think the best is Freud in the essay on the Unheimlich. This notion of the uncanny is that it isn't precisely scary as a monster outside you, but rather it's something that you kind of recognize because the Unheimlich actually is familiar from being inside you. And that's where I think hybrids operate in a way that's distinct from monsters. That some of them can be monstrous, but many of them are just these things that make you think, wow, that's strange. And that can be very useful. If we go back to our centaurs where we began, I think we began with them. Centaurs are always an expression in Greek myth for unbridled sexuality, right? The centaurs are famous. You only have to open a bottle of wine in their vicinity and they're all drunk. They're just drunk on the fumes. And they immediately grab any women nearby and they try to rape them. All right. So they are just unbridled sexuality. It's the drunken male theory that you were talking about earlier. Um, so you could say, if you wanted to apply a modern, psychology, you could say, well, that's the id. Mongo want, Mongo take, Mongo eat, right? But at the same time, for the Greeks, the most civilized, the hyper civilized figure is Chiron, who is another centaur. So, in typical Greek fashion, you get this exploration of ideas through the imagination by exploring oppositions, by exploring the opposites. Right? There's a beautiful vase that shows Heracles reclining with Pholos, one of the centaurs, and Pholos is sitting there with his legs folded underneath him, holding a drinking cup, and he looks like an Athenian gentleman. The same way that Chiron is normally wearing the garments of an Athenian gentleman. You look at it and then you realize, oh yeah, but there's a horse's ass sticking out the back. So, you get some, mainly Chiron, but you get a couple of centaurs that aren't just civilized. They're not just human. They're hyperhuman. Whereas most of the centaurs are hyper animal, despite the fact that they're partly human.
Yeah, I mean, I have a
So this is
tendency, I
exactly
think,
what I mean by
yeah, sorry, go on.
go, 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 go.
No, no, it is another little delay. I don't know whose connection it is. I'm just going to blame my connection. But I hate to be a literal thinker again and again. But I almost wonder if it's once again like the interaction with the people from the steppes that like seem like they're the barbaric, other that come and steal the women. But that also have their own philosophies, and that there's like a historicity to these stories um, that could be just like a direct metaphor.
There's some connection. There's no doubt about that. The trouble, of course, is that with the steppe cultures, the trouble from the point of view of studying the Greeks is that the steppe cultures don't leave literature. They don't leave those sorts of texts. So we're drawing inferences from things like, tattooed skin or the vessels that are found in their tombs, that sort of thing. And even those tend to be from a slightly later period. But those are cultures. Those steppe cultures are definitely cultures where the entanglement, to get back to our original term of human and animal, is even much more profound and much closer. Uh, the animals there aren't just emblems for tribes; they are aspects of us. Can I give you the most unusual example of this? It's not from the steppe. It's from Nigeria, and there is one ethnic group in Nigeria for whom, when a human being is born, at the same time, an animal is born in the wild, which is its soul twin. And everything that the human does in the course of its life in relation to the natural world is actually seen as mirrored by the behavior of the animal as well. They're coupled. And so it's actually a whole dyadic way of seeing the world in which we aren't at the top. We are, in fact, parallel to each one of us individually to a specific animal, which is our spirit partner.
Yeah, interesting. And I think of like
Yeah.
Native Americans who,
Oh, yeah.
would name their children after the first animal or thing in nature you see,
Sure,
and you could see
sure.
how that would be like a similar
Yeah,
pairing.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, I'm gonna just read out Chris's comment, and then I'm going to ask one last question, and then let you go because I realize you've been very generous with your time. But this is Chris just backing up the smithies again. It's hard work to be a
Okay.
smithy, especially for those suffering in the bellows. There's a strong stream in the literature about metallurgy and myth that associates lame smiths with arsenic exposure. So,
There you
uh,
go. I've learned
interesting.
something from this. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah. So you were mentioning previously about sort of the sexualization
Yeah.
of hybrids that specifically happened sort of in the 5th century BC. That there's sort of this beautification almost, like to make these hybrids, I think both the female and the male. Why do you think this was? Like, why was there this movement to all of a sudden make the monsters sexy?
Well, in the case of the Gorgon with Medusa, I actually think it's an Athenian way of undercutting the Argive claims to this being a special relationship. In Argos, you could actually see the funeral mound for Medusa, and names with the Gorgo compound from Gorgon are actually quite common in that part of the Peloponnese. So I think that the Athenians are actually, in a sense, poo-pooing that the power of that myth and suggesting that Perseus wasn't really the hero that he was cracked up to be at all. When it comes to centaurs, it's more complex, I think. And it's partly, this maybe was reflecting my own weird outlook, but it's partly that horses are actually very beautiful. And there is a way in which, if you do combine a human with a horse, it's a difficult thing from a philosophical point of view. And some of the Greeks talk about this. Would the animal eat the sustenance that sustains a human, or would its diet be a horsey diet? As soon as you get too far down the line of a contrafactual, it kind of collapses under the weight of logic. But there are a lot of centaurs in the 6th century, and I'm thinking particularly of bronze figurines, where the artist seems to be really interested in the sheer beauty of the animal. So that often what happens is you'll look at a figurine, and instead of looking at it head on at the human has his head turned. And so to look at him face on, you've actually then got to see the whole of the horse body. And to put those two together is it's a bit jarring, but again, it's not scary monstrous, but it is that wow moment. That's the only thing I can say there, really. It's well, that's not the only thing. I'll say one other thing. Even the centaurs, which, as I said, represent this unbridled sexuality, particularly in the early vases, even they can be redeployed in various interesting ways. This is my notion that the hybrids have many, many, many different functions. To give you an example, I walked into a museum in Palermo some years ago, and in the vitrine I was looking at, there was an amphora that showed two centaurs facing each other. The first centaur was the traditional style that we know, which is horse from the waist back and down. So the front legs are all horse legs. And he's got slightly pointy ears like a horse, and he's bearded, right? He's hirsute. He's a hairy centaur. The centaur that he's facing has got human legs at the front, which some centaurs have, and is a human all the way from his head to his toes. And the centaur part, the horse part, is actually grafted onto the back. Not the whole lower half of the body, but the back half of the body. Okay, you say, all right, we've got two style of centaur here, the horsey centaur and the human centaur. Fine. Except that the two centaurs are facing each other, and the horsey centaur has one hand reaching down towards the genitals of the other one, and in his other hand he's holding the other centaur by the wrist. Now, that image of by the wrist and then down towards the genitals, that's a pederastic motif. That's the way that older men as lovers, the erastes, are shown at the moment when they're seducing the eromenos, the beloved. And so we seem to have pederastic centaurs in the same way that on Cyprus we had hermaphrodite centaurs. And in fact, just to kind of cap it off, I can even show you from quite early, this is from the 7th century, a large pithos that has on it Perseus slaying Medusa, the Gorgon, right? And Medusa is in fact a Medusa centaur. Her head's been
Wow.
cut off. She's got all the hair coming down. She's attractive. She's shown with her breasts. And her whole back half is a horsey back half. Riddle me that, Batman.
I cannot explain that. No, not at
Yeah.
all.
See? It's almost as if you can take different components, different parts, and reassemble them in different ways. These are almost like, Lego figures.
Yeah. Wow. It really does make you turn on your head that the notion that there is just this is how the story goes. No, I mean
No,
you can really see just how malleable myths are and were.
this is an incredibly rich discourse. And we often make the mistake of thinking that if we have a poet such as Ovid, or even, better for these purposes, Apollodorus, and his myth compendium, that these versions are the version, but they're not. There is a local and there is a subaltern all range of alternatives bubbling up all the time through Greek culture and expressing themselves in different media, in different figurines, in different vases, in different iconography, even in different stories. But the master narrative is not the master narrative, or at least it's not the only narrative. It's just one.
Well, I think that's a great spot to stop and to reflect upon. So I want to say thank you so much, Jeremy, for joining me today and for giving us a deep dive into these just fantastic creatures. I will send this recording out to everybody afterwards with links to your book,
Thank you.
Centaurs and Snake Kings, Hybrids, and the Greek Imagination. We really only kind of scratched the surface here, though. So
Oh,
for those
absolutely.
who really want to get into it, and there's so many more cool hybrids that we didn't even get to discuss. So you can read it in the book and enjoy understanding this kind of really fascinating element of the ancient world even more.
Thanks, Anya. And thank you very much, all of you, for your comments and your questions. Thank you, Chris, for the extra information about metallurgy. And Anya, if you would share with people my email, I'm happy to continue the discussion with anyone who wants to write to me.
Well, thank you again, and thank you everybody, and thank you as well to Sean, our managing editor, who's always helping out as well. And I hope everybody has a happy Halloween. I hope you've got some really cool costumes ready, and I hope everyone has a wonderful, wonderful fall or summer or wherever you are.
Thank you.